Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvisha vahai. Om Shanti 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 Chaitanyam Sarvagam Sarvam Sarvabhutaguhashayam Yat Sarva Vishayatitam Tasmai Sarvavide Namaha. Very good. Welcome back. In the last couple of classes, we've seen this amazing presentation of Advaita Vedanta explaining how experience is even possible. And in our discussions, I hope you've appreciated how complex that topic really is. Complex enough that in Western philosophy and science, starting with Descartes, hundreds of years ago, they've been struggling with this problem. They're not any closer to solving it. It's that complex. One modern philosopher calls it the hard problem of consciousness. He called it that. Hard because they haven't figured it out in spite of all their effort. Anyway, Advaita Vedanta gave us these two wonderful metaphors to help us explain and understand our own experience. We talked about that Pratibimbavada and Avachedavada. We won't review them. We've seen them sufficiently. But there's one more comment I'd like to add to our prior discussion. Both of them show that experience is consciousness somehow conditioned by the mind. And the two metaphors show different ways in which that conditioning takes place. Pratibimbavada, by the ripples of the mind reflecting consciousness. Avachedavada, by the mind imposing a form upon consciousness. But one thing I failed to say, and it's actually going to come in today's discussion in verse 10. One thing I failed to say is, excuse me, is that the conditioning is not real conditioning. It is apparent conditioning. It is experienced conditioning. And this, you may think I'm being overly fussy. This is absolutely crucial to Advaita Vedanta. Because if the conditioning is real, if there's pain and sadness in your mind, then that pain and sadness really rubs off on your consciousness, and that you are immediately affected by that pain and sadness if the conditioning really affects consciousness. But as we've discussed in other chapters, not this chapter so far, but what we've discussed in other chapters is that consciousness remains unchanging and the conditioning is only apparent. It's observed, and the metaphor we've used many times to describe that apparent consciousness is the fact that this crystal appears to be affected by the orangeness of the cloth, but you know very well that the crystal remains perfectly clear in spite of the appearance of orangeness. This is crucial. The crystal remains perfectly clear, utterly unaffected by the orangeness of this cloth, in spite of what you see. In the same way, your consciousness remains utterly unaffected by whatever happens in your mind in spite of what you experience. I'm going to say that one more time because it is so important. Just like this crystal remains utterly unchanged, unaffected by the orangeness of the cloth, your consciousness remains utterly unaffected by the conditions of your mind in spite of your experience. In spite of seeing orangeness, the crystal is clear. In spite of experiencing pain and sadness, your consciousness remains utterly unaffected. And actually, we're going to see a reference to this particular teaching in verse 10. That's several verses ahead, so we'll come to that shortly. So with this, we can pick up the... would you click the mouse on the far right panel with the PowerPoint? I think the mouse got lost, sorry. This thing is really complicated. So the mouse gets lost, and then we have to recover the mouse like that. It actually gets lost here. So anyway, so that's what we need to do. And now I should be able to use the mouse, the remote, I mean. Okay, yes, okay. So let's pick up the third. Remember, the title of the chapter is dealing with swapna and smriti, with dream and memory. The topic of dream comes in a very primary way in several verses here. Karanam karma karta cha, karanam karma karta cha, kriya swapne phalam cha dhihi, kriya swapne phalam cha dhihi, jagratyevam yato drishta, jagratyevam yato drishta, drashta tasmat tonyata, drashta tasmat tonyata. Okay. In the second line, swapne, in a dream. In a dream, whatever is present is dhihi, end of the second line, thoughts. Whatever happens in a dream is thoughts. So suppose in the dream, I needed a metaphor to explain all of these words. Suppose you're pounding a nail into wood. Probably not something you do every day, but it's an example. You're pounding a nail into wood. So in that dream action, there is a karanam, a means, that's a hammer. There is a karma, an object, in this case it's the nail. There is a karta, an agent of action, a doer, that's you, the dream you, the projection of yourself into the dream world. There is a kriya, action, the act of pounding the nail, and there is phalam, result. The nail gets pounded into the wood. So all of these are present in a dream in the form of mental activities, thoughts, vrittis. Okay, so far? Here's the surprising part. Jagrati eva, evam, jagrati evam, yataha drishta. That yataha goes to the next line. So jagrati evam. It is evam. It is absolutely the same, jagrati, when you're awake. When you're awake, meaning everything that happens is in your mind. Is it really? If you're pounding a nail, the nail is in your mind? The hammer is in your mind? Well, remember our discussion about how perception works? The hammer out here in your hand is outside, but the hammer you experience directly is what your eyes pick up and creates in your mind as a mental image, right? We've had this discussion several times. So even though there is a hammer in your hand, the hammer you experience in the most direct way is a hammer in your mind. Similarly, the nail, the karma. There is a nail out here, but the nail you experience more directly than the nail out here is the nail presented to you in your mind. Similarly, there is a karta, an agent of action in your mind. You have a self-concept. We call it ahankara, so simply ego, that sense of being who you are, which is also in your mind. When you feel like, I am pounding this nail, hammering this nail, that sense of I. It's not your body. By the way, does your body pound the nail? I pound the nail. That I is the ego, ahankara. Also, the action is in your mind. When the nail goes all the way in, it's all equally in your mind. This is, I've used the word before, counterintuitive, to say that everything out there is in your mind. So it's crucial to reflect on our analysis of perception. And the result of our process, our five senses, present to us a model in our mind which represents the world. It is a mental representation of the world, and that's what we experience most directly. There is a world outside, but we're not talking about that. The world you experience directly is not the outside world, it's the world inside your mind. Now, what is the consequence? That's a very philosophical perspective. It's in some ways similar to the Western philosophy of idealism. Idealism is a philosophy that says what is real is not stuff, but ideas. Mind is real. Anyway, that's another topic we won't go into. But that is philosophy. And I've said how many times that Vedanta is not a philosophy, so there must be some way in which that teaching is important to help us become free from suffering, which is Vedanta. And this teaching, of course, is crucial to help us understand and become free from suffering, and that's in the last line. And we have to make the connection. Yataha drishta, because of all these things being seen or experienced in your mind, in the last line, tasmat, therefore, drashta, the seer, the observer, the witness, sakshi. That sakshi, tataha anyata, is separate from all of those things. Separate means unaffected. Your consciousness reveals whatever happens. So the first half was dream. Your consciousness makes known whatever happens in your mind during the dream state. By the way, whatever happens in a dream, does it really affect you? So if suppose you're being chased by a wild animal, and I'm just trying, dreams go like this. You're being chased by someone with a weapon. Anyway, you're being chased, and as you're running away, you fall over a cliff, or you get run over by a car, or some horrible thing happens to you. How does that affect you? Remember, it's happening in a dream. So it doesn't affect you at all because it's just thoughts in your mind. Then he makes the transition and said, well, how different is it when you're awake? So all of that lion or being chased and getting run over by the car doesn't affect you in a dream, but then in the waking state, the point Shankaracharya is making here is it's not so different. Everything is still happening in your mind. Yes, there is an outside world, but what we experience most directly is what's happening in our mind, and in that sense, it's no different. And if things don't affect you meaning consciousness, you meaning the consciousness that reveals the activities in your dream, you meaning the consciousness that reveals the activities in your mind right now in the waking state, that consciousness, the consciousness which is your swarupa, your true nature, remains utterly unaffected. That's the idea of this crystal metaphor. You experience it. You experience orangeness, but there is no orangeness. You experience pounding in a nail in a dream or in a waking state, but consciousness doesn't pound in nails. Consciousness doesn't do anything, and that point is actually going to come. So let's proceed. Buddhyadi namanatmatvam, buddhyadi namanatmatvam, heyopadeya rupataha, heyopadeya rupataha, hanopadana kartatma, hanopadana kartatma, natyajyo nacha grihyate, natyajyo nacha grihyate. Excuse me. So in the previous verse, we talked about the dream state and the waking state. What about the significance of deep sleep? That's what's being discussed in this verse. He says, Buddhyadi nam anatmatvam, the anatmatvam, the status of being other than I, consciousness. The status of being anatma, the status of being not me, and the status for what? Buddhyadi nam, for the mind, thoughts, whatever you see, hear, taste, smell, and touch, whatever you experience. So whatever you experience is anatma, for the various obvious reason that atma is the experiencer. Atma is the experiencer, so anything experienced by definition is anatma. And all of this is established because heya upadeya rupataha, because of its nature, rupataha, because of its nature of heya and upadeya. These are technical terms. Shankara is a great scholar, so whenever a normal word will do, he'll go for a technical word. But here, heya is literally that which you accept. Heya is that which you reject. Got them backwards. That which you reject is heya. Upadeya is that which you ascertain, that which you grasp, that which you accept. But here it simply means heya, that which goes away, and upadeya, which comes. He could have said come and go, which would have been much simpler, but he likes his technical vocabulary, so he uses heya, upadeya. But it simply means they come and go. Heya, go, upadeya, come. What comes and goes? The thoughts in your mind. When do they come? When you're awake and when you're dreaming. When do they go? In deep sleep. They come during waking and dream, activities in your mind, vrittis, during waking and dream, and then in deep sleep, your mind remains silent. Therefore, Shankara makes this point. Hana upadana karta atma. He says, atma, your true self, consciousness, is the reason that they come and go. And there's a little bit of logic here we have to appreciate. If there were no observer, how can you talk about coming and going? Coming and going is only with reference to an observer. In Western culture, they always give the example. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does the tree make a sound? Depends on how you define sound. If you define sound as vibrations in the air, as science does, then absolutely the tree makes a sound when it falls and no one is there. But if you define sound as an experience, which is generally how we define sound, if no one is there in the forest to hear the tree falling, then there's no sound. Sound, if sound is an experience, sound depends on an experiencer. So therefore, the answer to that question, does a tree make any sound? If sound is an experience and no one is there to experience it, the answer is clearly no. Similarly, suppose there was no one, what did they use as the expression? There's no one home inside. You know that expression. Suppose there's no one home to observe the activities of your mind, to observe actions happening in your mind in the waking and dream state, and no one is home to observe how quiet the mind is in deep sleep. If there's no one home, then there's no coming and going. So, consciousness, unchanging consciousness, remains in waking state, dream state, remains unchanged in deep sleep. We've had this discussion many times. We've gone through many arguments that establish that you are as conscious in deep sleep as you are right now. And I don't want to take you through all of those arguments, but just to remind you of one powerful argument, what we've used again and again. If you stand in a perfectly dark closet with your eyes wide open, do you see? Do you have the power of sight? Your power of sight doesn't go away. You see in that dark closet, there's nothing to be seen. The same is true in deep sleep. You are conscious, there's nothing to be conscious of. That consciousness remains, and that consciousness, in the last line, natyajyaha. Again, Shankara goes for more complex words. Tyajya is that which you reject, grahyate, that which you accept. But he's talking about simply coming and going. Consciousness, natyajyaha, doesn't go. Nacha grahyate, nor does it come. In the waking state, thoughts come. In the dream state, thoughts meaning mental activities, all mental activities. In the waking state, they come. In the dream state, they come. In deep sleep, they go. Consciousness never comes or goes. That unchanging consciousness. And we've had this discussion several times before. Next. Sabbahyabhyantare shuddhe, sabbahyabhyantare shuddhe, prajnanaikarase ghane, prajnanaikarase ghane, bahya, bahyamabhyantaram chanyata, bahyamabhyantaram chanyata, katham heyam prakalpyate, katham heyam prakalpyate. So the first half he describes consciousness. Shankara describes consciousness as sabahya abhyantara, that which is outside, bahya, and antara, abhyantara, inside. That which is outside and inside. This is a reference to another discussion we've had about the fact that consciousness doesn't get stuck inside your cranium. This one. You can't keep it inside because it is formless, boundaryless, edgeless. It is like space, all-pervasive. All-pervasive consciousness, which we call the so-called inner divinity, that consciousness is manifest in your mind, but it's not stuck there. It's not confined to your mind, which is why so many times we joke about the expression, your consciousness, which I use again and again and again, but in fact, there is no your consciousness or my consciousness. There is only one all-pervasive consciousness. We've talked about that. So that all-pervasive consciousness, sabahya bhyantara, that consciousness which is shuddha. Shuddha means pure. Pure in the sense that it's unaffected by anything else. Just like this crystal remains pure in a sense of clear. It remains perfectly clear regardless of the orangeness you see. In the same way, consciousness remains perfectly, we can't say clear, so we'll say consciousness remains utterly unaffected by whatever you experience. And it is called prajnana eka rasa. Prajnana eka rasa. Prajnana simply means consciousness, one of many words we use. Chit, chaitanya, chetana, here, prajnana. No, they all mean consciousness. They're all synonyms. We don't try to make any shade of meaning between them. Consciousness. So we're talking about consciousness, but what Shankara says here, that consciousness is eka rasa. It has one nature. And this is used in a technical sense in Advaita Vedanta to say that, I'm laughing because when you see translations, the translations sound very funny. Typically, this would be called prajnana eka rasa. It would be called, the term they use this, unalloyed consciousness. Unalloyed. Unalloyed? What are you talking about? Unalloyed consciousness. It's actually a accurate translation. When metal is alloyed, it's mixed with something else, right? So when consciousness is unalloyed, it's not mixed with anything else. So it's actually a very accurate term, but it sounds so strange. Unalloyed consciousness. So I avoid that. So I translated here undifferentiated. It is consciousness and consciousness alone. The commentator uses in Advaita Vedanta, there's a traditional metaphor that goes with this expression, and that is of a crystal of salt. Now, if you put salt on your food, the salt is mixed with the food, but it's mostly food. If you put salt in water, the water tastes salty, but it's mostly water. What about a crystal of salt? It's only salt. Nothing but salt. And that's what that term eka rasa means. Unalloyed consciousness. At least now when you read that, you'll understand what in the world the author means. It's an accurate word, but it's just confusing. And the final adjective, which is very important, he uses is ghana, which literally means thick or dense. Consciousness is thick or dense. That's a way of saying unchanging. Tell me, can that crystal, the crystal of salt is definitely ghana. It's dense, it's thick. If you press on it, can you bend it? Can you make it smaller? Can you stretch it out? You can't deform that crystal of salt because it is ghana. It is, now this is worse than unalloyed, and that is undeformable. Making up all these strange English words, which are actually quite accurate in spite of the fact that they sound strange. So undeformable, that crystal cannot be deformed because it is ghana. Consciousness cannot be deformed, cannot be altered, cannot be affected in any way whatsoever. So it's a really nice metaphor, that crystal of salt. I think it comes originally in I think Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, but I might be wrong. I think it comes there. Anyway, so Shankara first defines what is consciousness, and he says, and all of that is an allocative case, which means in that consciousness. In that consciousness which is all-pervasive, in that consciousness which is pure, unaffected, in that consciousness which is prajnana, ekarasa, which is unalloyed, which is consciousness and consciousness alone, in that consciousness which is ghana. What is the word we used? Undeformable, absolutely unaffected. In that consciousness, Shankara says in the last line, katam, in that consciousness which is he says in the last line, in that consciousness, katam, how? Prakalpyate, how can you possibly imagine in that consciousness anything which is bahyam, outside, abhyantaram cha, inside, anyat, or otherwise? How can you imagine in that consciousness any object, outside, like outside in the world, inside, like inside your mind? How can you imagine any object which is heyam, and again he's using his complicated words, that which goes away, and it implies upadeyam, that which comes. Let me explain that last line. In unchanging, in fact, that's very simple if you paraphrase it. In unchanging consciousness, how can anything come and go? That's it. That's all it means. In unchanging consciousness, how can anything come and go? What is it that can come? We talked about waking state, mental activities come. Dream state, mental activities come. Deep sleep, mental activities go away. These three states are states of experience. Such a huge confusion. I think I have a whole video about this. These three states, waking, dream, and sleep, are often incorrectly said to be states of consciousness. Let's talk about this. This is a common mistake. It's a huge blunder. States of consciousness. We've been discussing how consciousness is unchanging. And then they say, well, there are these three states of consciousness, and then there's turiya, the fourth state of consciousness, transcendent consciousness. You have to reach that state of transcendent consciousness. There are states, including turiya, but all these are states of the mind, are they not? Waking state is a condition of the mind, not a condition of consciousness. Dream state is a state of the mind. It's not a state of consciousness. Deep sleep is a state of the mind. It's not a state of consciousness. Samadhi is a state of the mind, not a state of consciousness. But tell me, how many times have you read states of consciousness? It's a huge misunderstanding. Consciousness is unchanging. Therefore, it has no states. Ekarasa and ghana. We just saw those adjectives. It is unalloyed. I like these words. That consciousness is unalloyed and undeformable. How can it have states? You can't mix anything into it, nor can you change it. Undeformable, ghana, it can't change. Unchanging consciousness has no states. That unchanging consciousness is who you really are. Right now, just reflect on this for a moment. Who are you? You're the one paying attention. I hope you're paying attention. This is a heavy class. It's easy to tune out. I know how that happens. So you are the one paying attention to this class, which means paying attention to what? Are you paying this is a little quiz. Are you paying attention to the orange-robed fellow sitting in this chair, or in a more direct sense, are you paying attention to the recreation of this fellow in your mind, right? So what you're paying attention to in the most direct sense is a Swami who has been they use that for orange juice, reconstituted. And that's appropriate because I'm orange. So just like orange juice reconstituted means it starts out as pulp and then they add water to it. You probably know that. Anyway, so orange juice can be reconstituted and orange Swami can be reconstituted in your mind. Who is the one who knows the reconstituted Swami in your mind? Consciousness. The consciousness which you think is ordinary, Shankara uses these fancy words. He says, what you think is ordinary is ekarasa. Nothing can get intermixed with it. The consciousness which you think is ordinary is ghana, utterly unchanging. And that utterly unchanging consciousness is called, the little Sanskrit you should know, avastha traya sakshi. I'll explain these words. Avastha, state. Traya, three states. Three states of consciousness? No. Three states of experience. Three states of mind. Avastha traya sakshi, the awareful witness, the unchanging consciousness by which the three changing states of the mind are known. Okay. Oh, we have some time, good. we have now a new topic. Let's see the verse first. Yahatma neti neti ti, yahatma neti neti ti, parapohena sheshitaha, parapohena sheshitaha, sachet brahma viratmeshto, sachet brahma viratmeshto, yate tatah param katam, yate tatah param katam. Sorry. Good. We've said in prior classes that Vedanta is based on Shruti, Yukti, and Anubhava. Just remind you about these three words: Shruti, scripture; Yukti, reasoning; and Anubhava, experience. That Anubhava experience is of two kinds. One kind is your ordinary experience. And for example, we've discussed how the consciousness present in your experience right now is utterly unchanging. So notice we're using your experience. And we're also using Shruti, utterly unchanging. How do we know? First of all, you know the consciousness that's present in your experience right now. That is Anubhava. And then how do we discover that it is unchanging? With the help of Shruti, with the help of scripture, and then confirmed by your experience. Is there anything, this is a little tangent, but interesting one. Is there anything in your experience that proves that your consciousness changes? This is very, I don't think we've ever tried this before. Is there anything in your experience that can negate Vedanta's assertion that your consciousness is unchanging? How would you prove that you're conscious, for example, in deep sleep? How would you prove that your consciousness turns off, like the light bulb in your refrigerator? How would you prove that? It's an idea, it's a concept, but it ends up being unprovable, hypothetical, theoretical. For example, how could you prove, without me moving this crystal, how could you prove that the crystal really is orange? Prove it. I can easily prove that the crystal is not orange. How would you prove that it really is orange? How would you prove that the orangeness of this cloth really affects the crystal? You can't. Because it's not. The reality is, it's not an orange crystal. How can you prove something that's false? Or with wrong logic, I suppose, but wrong logic is not a proof. So anyway, you get my point, and that is, Anubhava, your experience, cannot disprove the teaching of Vedanta that says your consciousness is unchanging. In addition to that observation, there's another way we can understand. How can I be sure that consciousness is unchanging? Well, one way is not your Anubhava, but the experience of an enlightened person. So ask someone who you think is enlightened, and you ask the person, does your consciousness change? And what will he or she say if they're enlightened? They will say, no. My consciousness, which is not my consciousness anyway, that one universal, all-pervasive consciousness, which is manifest in my mind right now, that consciousness is unchanging. That consciousness may seem to be apparently conditioned by the nature of the mind, but that conditioning is apparent. The conditioning is not real. Consciousness remains ekarasa and ghana, unalloyed and undeformable. Simply, you can't mix anything with it, and it can't change, unchanging. So we can refer to what we call vidvat anubhava, the experience of an enlightened person. And what we see here in this verse is based on vidvat anubhava. What is the experience of the enlightened person? And we've already said the enlightened person can confirm for you that consciousness doesn't change. The enlightened person can also tell you more about the nature of enlightenment. So that's what Shankara explains here. What is the experience of the enlightened person? Yaha atma neti neti iti. Through this neti neti, negation. Not this, not this, not this. I, consciousness. Consciousness is not this, not this, not this. Anything that is a this is not an I. That's neti neti, right? Negating all objects. Anything that is a this gets negated. So what remains? Atma, I, sheshitaha, I remains, para apohena. When you negate, when you remove apoha, when you remove everything else. So when you remove everything else through this process of negation, I am not this, I am not this, I am not this. And by the way, that doesn't mean I am not a table, I am not a chair. That's not neti neti, that's just being silly. I am not the sadness present in my mind. That's negation. I am separate, I am independent of the sadness present or agitation or whatever it is in my mind. That's the kind of negation we need. We don't need to say, I'm not a table, I'm not a chair. Anyone knows that. But to know that you are separate and independent of sadness when it's present in your mind, that's the negation that counts. And of course, it's not just sadness, it's many things that you experience, things that seem to affect you, but things that don't truly affect you. So, apohena, para apohena, when you negate all that you are not, atma sheshitaha, yaha atma sheshitaha, the atma that remains, the conscious self that remains. Sahachet in the third line. Sahachet brahmavit atma ishtaha. Chet, suppose. Suppose that person, by the way, neti neti itself doesn't result in enlightenment. It just means what I'm not. So negation means I'm not this, I'm not this, I'm not this. Then what am I? What's left? You might remember that Buddhists also use this neti neti technique. And what remains when they're done with neti neti? Shunyam. Nothing. So the Buddhist method of negation ends up with nothing remaining. They call it shunyam, emptiness, nothingness. But in Vedantic negation, what remains is I, the essence of the negator. We're not going to get into an argument with the Buddhists right now. That's not the point of our class. So what remains is the essence of the negator, which is consciousness. But what is that consciousness? So in the third line, he says, Brahma-vichara. If you discover that what remains after this process of negation, the consciousness that remains is identical to Brahman, the underlying reality because of which everything exists. And that's a truth revealed by the Mahavakya, right? Tat tvam asi, you are that. Your consciousness is identical to the underlying reality because of which everything exists. Atma is Brahman. That's the meaning of the Mahavakya. If one discovers that, so notice it's like step one is neti, but there's a step two. What is step two? Mahavakya. Tattvam asi, you are that. Notice it's the opposite of neti. Neti is negation. Tattvam asi is assertion. The Buddhists can do the negation, but Vedanta makes that final assertion. You are that unchanging consciousness. And suppose one discovers it, then, this is describing the enlightened person's experience, then for that person, katam, how, ataha, we have to break apart these words, yateta ataha, thereafter, ataha. After the negation, then step one, after step two, discovering that the consciousness that remains after negation, that consciousness is Brahman, that's step two, that is enlightenment. So then after these two steps are completed, ataha, after that, then katam, why, yateta param. Why would that enlightened person make any further effort? What is, and to paraphrase, what is left to be accomplished? And let me put this in a little context here, and then we'll finish up our class. Before becoming enlightened, it's necessary that you've already dealt with worldly desires. The one who can gain enlightenment is one who has become free from raga dvesha. We need to put this in context. One who is free from desires, one who is free from these compulsions to chase after what you want and run away from what you don't want. Let me just say, one who understands, and this really is a good way of putting it, one who understands that fulfilling worldly desires will never bring perfect contentment. That comes first. What comes first? Knowing that fulfilling worldly desires will not lead to perfect contentment. What will lead to perfect contentment? Moksha, liberation, enlightenment. But notice then, there's a desire that remains. Even though this person has turned away from all worldly desires, there's one desire that remains. The last desire you will ever have will be the desire for moksha. Why is it the last desire? Is after gaining enlightenment, goes away. Naturally, when you fulfill a desire, it goes away. If you desire gulab jamun, so anyway, lots of sweets. If you have If you desire gulab jamun, after eating that sweet, your desire for it goes away. Of course, plenty of other desires are still there. That particular desire goes away. But so one desire goes away, there are thousands of more. We're talking about the last desire. The last desire is the desire for moksha, desire for liberation. When that desire goes away, what would that feel like? What would it feel like to be truly desireless? Actually, it's not so hard to imagine. We call it contentment. That's all it is. We've all had plenty of moments of contentment. A moment of contentment is a moment when everything is fine. You say, sab theek hai. Everything is fine. Just fine. In fact, don't you feel that right now? Everything is fine. There's no problem. Until you go home and you discover all the problems you have to deal with. But this moment, what do you desire? What do you want? There's nothing to want. This is a moment of perfect contentment. Suppose you felt the same way when you went home. Yeah, the problems are there, but you still felt the same kind of contentment. When you go home, when you go to work, of course you've got to deal with whatever it is you have to deal with, but suppose you could maintain the feeling of contentment that you have right now. That's what Shankara is describing here. It's a condition called krita krityata. Everything that needs to be accomplished is accomplished. Nothing remains to be accomplished in life. It's a condition of perfect contentment. I think he goes on for one more verse to discuss that. We'll see that in our next class. Announcement, I think the only announcement is today at 4 p.m. we have a Samashraya support group. It's a support group for caregivers, giving care to those who have mental illness. So if you are a caregiver of someone with mental illness, that support group may be helpful for you. Vasanti coordinates it, and it meets at 4 p.m. So you can come and join that. We'll conclude with our prayers. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschad Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Satgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Hamritangamaya Om Shanti 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 Om Tat Sat.